Hi, I'm Pam Fox. Welcome back to my Bible study. We're going through the book of Genesis, and today we're in chapter 31. Last week we'll just do a really quick catch up on where we're at. We're still in the story of Jacob, who's the grandson of Abraham, who is the man that God chose to make the covenant with and start his chosen people, this group of people he would pull out of all of humanity and put his mark on, so to speak, so that when everyone looked at those people, they would know who their God was. The God who claims to be the creator of all, one and only God, the God that claims to be king of the universe, almighty ruler, the one and only God. And so he wanted this group of people to be highlighted amongst humanity so that when people saw them, they would be interested, they would be curious, they would um, want to get to know who this God was, who he was about, what he looked like, what he stood for, all of that. And so God chose Abraham to begin this covenant, which is a contract, and he said through him would come all families. And we know that was a prophecy about Jesus Christ, because through Christ, if we put our faith in Jesus Christ, repent of our sins, and believe in God and his goodness, then we can be saved. Saved from what? Well, saved from an eternity separated from God, basically. When you understand the doctrine of the Christian faith, you understand that this life is just a blip on a much bigger screen, a much bigger perspective. Then the perspective is eternity. It's eternal life, and um, God, um, he's like he's like Father, and we're like his children. But this these lives that we live are an opportunity for us to learn about God, to learn about his goodness, and choose whether or not we want to stand with and for God and his goodness, or stand against it. And those who choose to stand against it, it would be like if you were a parent and your child said, you know what, I don't love you. I don't love who you are, what you stand for. I'm going to go live my life over here and do my own thing, what I believe in, what I stand for, and I'm going to reject you. And I don't want any part of you, and I'm not going to think of you. I'm going to go and do my own thing. And that parent, there's only so much you can do when it comes to like controlling your children, right? They have to live their own lives. And so the parent has to say, well, that really breaks my heart, but I'm going to let you go. Um, and really, that's just my little paraphrase of what this life on earth kind of, in a sense, in part anyway, why we're here. It's to really be in a place where we can get to know God without getting to know God, right? Without being in his presence. We're here and we're with his creation, and we understand, and we get to see what it looks like to live in a world without God. He's here, but he's not here. You know what I mean? Anyway, so back in these Bible days, God chose Abraham to begin this process of bringing his children to himself. And it started with Abraham, and it started with the Jews. But then, if you know anything about Jesus and his ministry, all of God's goodness and his promises were extended to all people through Jesus Christ, and what he did at the cross. And so now all of God's promises, eternal life, and eternal life living in the presence of God in his paradise, those promises are extended to anyone who chooses, who receives that free gift and chooses, says, I believe in God. I believe in God's goodness. I stand for God. I stand with God. I belong to God. So anyway, all that to say, this is where it all began. And so here in chapter 30, last week, we talked more about Jacob, who was the grandson of Abraham. And this covenant that God made with Abraham, he extended it. He reconfirmed it through his son Isaac, and then he reconfirmed it again through his son Jacob, which is where we're focused on now in the book, on Jacob, his life, his wives, his children. And remember, these people were people. They weren't perfect just because they're in the Bible. They weren't perfect just because they happen to believe in God. They were people, which meant they were screw ups, which meant they didn't do things perfectly, which meant they made poor choices. Um, and that's, to me, when I go back and read these old stories in the Old Testament and see some of the things that people did and said, and the mistakes and the bad choices that were repeated, it's like, gosh, what's the matter with these people? Why can't they learn a lesson? But really, if I were to insert myself into the day back then, I know I wouldn't have done any better. I probably would have done worse. So, because we're human, and as much as we like to think we're all that, we're not all that. We are imperfect. We do make poor choices. We hide the parts about ourselves that we're ashamed of and that we don't like, and we shine a light on those aspects in other people and say, "Oh, look at that person. He's a terrible person." We were last week. We were really kind of going over what happened with Jacob and how, he fell in love with Rachel, and he made an agreement with her dad Laban that he would work for 7 years and then he would marry her. As was, the custom back in the day. You didn't just say, "Oh, I dig you, let's go." I mean, the daughters belonged to the fathers, and so Jacob had to strike an agreement. He had to pay for her, and he didn't have any money, so he worked for 7 years. But then Laban tricked Jacob, and he gave Jacob Leah instead of Rachel to be his wife. So in the night of their um, consummation, he consummated the marriage with Leah, who, I don't know if it was just dark or if she had a veil on or how all of that worked, but he consummated the marriage with Leah. He found out in the morning and he was pissed. So he had to strike another deal with Laban saying, "Okay, I still want to marry Rachel." She was his fiance. They got engaged 7 years prior when he struck this deal with Laban. They were in love. And so he strikes another deal with Laban, 7 more years. So he does. He works for 7 more years. And what we discovered last week is that in that first 7 years, of course, Jacob was a single man working for Laban, and he had no children. But then he married Leah, and they had 4 children in the next 7. So if we look at this time that Jacob lived in the household of Laban, it was 20 years. There was 7, 7, and 6. So that first 7, he was a single man, no children. The second 7, he was married to Leah. They had 4 children. The next 6, he was married to Rachel, but she couldn't get pregnant. So Rachel decides, "Here's my handmaid. Let's have children through her," which is what Abraham. Remember Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and that whole thing. That's what they did. And so Rachel's handmaid has 2 children. They're in that last 6 years in Laban's household. They have 2 children, but in the meantime, Leah wasn't getting pregnant either. And so she says, "Here's my handmaid. Let's have more children through her." So in that final 6 years, the between the two of them, they had 2 children each. They had 4 more sons. So at that point, Jacob had 8 sons. The original 4 with Leah, 2 with Rachel's handmaid, 2 with Leah's handmaid. And then Leah gets pregnant, and she has 2 more sons. In that final 6 years, there was a lot going on. And then finally, Rachel gets pregnant. She has the son Joseph. And that's when Jacob goes to Laban and says, it's time for us to go. I worked 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel, 6, and then now we're in that. And so at that point, we can presume that they were probably in the 3rd year of that final 6. In other words, 14, 15, 16, 17, the 17th year, when Joseph was born. It would have been right around there. We don't know that for certain, but if you do the math, that's about the earliest that he could have approached. Because it says after Joseph was born, Jacob says, that's when he tells Laban, "We got to go. I want to go back to my homeland. I want to build a home for my family. I want to not work for you anymore. It's time for us to go." So at that point, it would have been probably about halfway into that final 6 years. That would have given both of the handmaids time to have the 2 children. And did Leah have? And then for Leah to have her 2 more children. And then for Rachel to have the 1. It might have been further out in that 6 years. I don't know why I'm harping on this. I just find it really interesting to kind of think about these timelines and how much time they would have had. But basically, Jacob would have had 1 to 3 years to amass this great wealth that we talked about last week. This deal, he comes to Laban, he says, it's time for us to go. Laban says, I don't want you to go because everything you touch turns to gold. And if you leave, I'm not going to be a wealthy man anymore because you work for me. So they strike this final deal where basically Jacob says, the striped and speckled animal or cattle you'll give to me, everything else you'll keep. And so Laban, in his sneakiness, he pulls out all the striped and speckled cattle. And so all Jacob has are these solid colored. But we saw that he had a plan to strip the bark from these particular trees and to, from those basins. And when they had their offspring, they would be striped. And that's what ended up happening. And so last week I was talking about, we don't know if God, told Jacob to do this, but we obviously know that it worked. And today we're going to see a little bit more about that, which is an example of, if you've ever heard me talk about how these Old Testament stories, or any of the books of the Bible really that are written by Jewish people, they're written in what you could call a Hebraic style, which isn't similar to what you and I are used to, a very linear chronological expectation when we read through a story or an account or history. We expect that linear chronological explanation to be able to fully understand it. The Hebraic style really gives little blurbs and puzzle pieces of information, and then we're expected with our intellect to kind of put it all together and make sense of it. It makes it more of a mysterious way to read and kind of have to decipher and interpret and figure out like what is actually being said here by grabbing all of these puzzle pieces. And this is a great example of that, because last week I was saying, we don't know. We don't know if Jacob was instructed by God to do this thing with the animals in order to amass his wealth. Today we're going to see in chapter 31 a little bit more about that and how we're going to get another piece of the puzzle to help us maybe better understand what was happening there in terms of Jacob amassing his wealth with in the way he did with the livestock. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. We're in chapter 31 of Genesis, and I'm in the King James Version. Here we go. So it takes right off from where we were last week. And he heard and he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten, rumoring that everything that our father had has been taken by Jacob. That's what they're saying. And I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe it was. We know that his plan worked, and he took a lot of Laban's livestock. I don't know if he took all of it. It's quite possible there. That's what the sons were saying, that Jacob has taken everything from our father. And the glory, which means that Jacob amassed great wealth, but he also amassed a certain degree of fame, notoriety. People knew who he was. He was the son-in-law of Laban at the deficit of his father-in-law. Verse 2, and Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. Which means that countenance means face. So he's basically saying before Jacob, Laban and Jacob, they were tight. Like Laban loved Jacob because he was a hard worker and he was making Laban prosperous. So his countenance was turned toward him. So to turn your countenance away is like, it's like giving someone the silent treatment. You don't want to talk to that person. You're mad at that person. You despise that person. You're not happy with that person. So he says, and Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. Verse 3, and the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. So here we have Jacob mentioning that he has had communication with God. God says, the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. He basically told him, it's time to go back to your homeland, and I'm going to go with you. I will be with you. Verse 4, and Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock. And I find this interesting. He's calling a meeting with his wives, Rachel and Leah, out in the field where no one else can overhear their conversation. He has something to say to them. What does he say? Verse 5, and said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before. but the God of my father hath been with me. And ye know that with all my power I have served your father. With all my power I've served your father these last 14 years. And your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. So he's talking about this deceit. He made a deal with Laban. He would work for 7 years for the hand of Rachel. And on the night of the consummation, after that 7 years, he ended up consummating the marriage with Leah because of Laban. Laban deceived Jacob. And it says he also changed his wages 10 times, which I don't really know what that means. They don't go into detail, but for whatever reason, Laban was, he was going back and forth. He wasn't holding his word. He changed his wages 10 times. It says, but God suffered him not to hurt me. In other words, Jacob continued to be blessed. Verse 8, and he said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ring-straked shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ring-straked. He's kind of just reconfirming what's been going on, that, he made this deal with their dad, that all of the speckled and striped animals would become Jacob's. And that's what happened. They started becoming speckled and striped. And, instead of having, I remember one time we had this Doberman and she had a litter of puppies. Like, I don't know, it seemed like it was like 9 or 10 puppies. And they were all black. Some of them had a little bit of brown, maybe a brown tipped tail or something, but they were all solid black except for one had this like a brown stripe on it. And he really stood out from the other puppies. And to me, it made him more special. But here in these days, there were certain animals within the herds that were considered, the norm. And then there was the speckled or the striped, and they were considered the rarity. And they weren't necessarily considered, special or important. They were considered less special and less important, weaker. And so when Jacob made this deal with Laban, Laban was fine with it. It's like, you want the rare animals, you want the weak animals, fine, you can have them. But that ended up not being the case. The animals started having these litters, and they would be mostly, if not all, striped and speckled, and so then they would go to Jacob. So he's telling Rachel all of this. He's just kind of going over it, letting them know, kind of setting up, what he's about to tell them, which is, it's time for us to go. So he says, you know that with all my power I have served your father. Your father, we already read this. Verse 9, he says, thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. He's telling them, your father's wealth now belongs to me. And it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes and saw a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob, I am. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up now thine eyes, and see, all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled, for I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. So he's telling Rachel and Leah that God did visit him, that he had a vision, he had a dream, that the angel of God did speak to him and showed him this dream, which he interpreted to mean to make this deal with Laban, that these rare animals would now belong to me, and I'll stay and I'll work for my, because he wanted to go. Basically, Joseph had been born, and he approached Laban and said, it's time for us to go. But the deal that they struck was that he would stay and work for him, and that these rare and weaker animals, yes, Jacob could have those. That was the deal. But then the animals started having all rare and weaker animals, at least, you know what I mean. So he's explaining this to Rachel and Leah, and he goes on to say, I am, what God was saying to Jacob. He said, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Do you guys remember that? It was just a couple weeks ago, I think in chapter 28 or 29. As soon as Jacob got to the land of his grandfather Abraham, which is here now in the land of Nahor, or whatever you want to call it, Laban's area. As soon as he approached that area, he stopped, he built an altar, and God visited him there and reconfirmed the vow, or the covenant. He reconfirmed the covenant that he made with Abraham, and he said the covenant continues through your family, through you, The idea that you're going to inherit the land, that you're going to grow a great nation, and that through, this covenant would become a blessing for all people. So he reconfirmed the covenant there with Jacob um, when he came into the area. And then Jacob made a vow to him that you will be my God, we will be your people. And he promised a tenth of all of his wealth to give back to God. That was the vow that he made. So here, God is reminding him of the vow that he made, of the covenant, of that day there when he made the pillar and he made that vow. He said, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar and where thou vowest a vow unto me. He says, now arise, get thee out from this land and return into the land of thy kindred. It's time to go. So he's telling Rachel and Leah all of this, that he's had a communication from God, and God says it's time to go. And Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, before we go on, that's what I was talking about a few minutes ago when I said we have more information. Jacob did receive information from God, and so that does kind of explain this idea that he had to ferment the branches in the water and have the animals drink. It was probably something that maybe he'd heard of that produces more speckled and spotted animals. Maybe God did tell him that part of it. We don't know. But we do know that God intended for him to strike this deal with Laban as a way for him to amass great wealth so that he would have a way to take his family and leave. Because if he didn't have wealth, he would just have to leave on his own. He has to be able to provide for his family. And although he did work for his family, he purchased Leah and Rachel. Back then, that would have been the understanding that those two women don't belong to their father anymore. They belong to Jacob. And if he didn't have wealth, he wouldn't have been able to, well, he wouldn't have been able to provide for them, but he wouldn't have been able to legally say, I have worked for this family. They now belong to me. Um, if he had no wealth, to show for that work. So this is my understanding of how that worked anyhow. So here we are out in the field, and what do Rachel and Leah say? They say, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? Quite devoured also our money. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours and our children's. Let's stop there. So Rachel and Leah, they're asking these questions. They're making statements. They're basically saying, is there any portion of inheritance for us in our father's house? They're basically saying there is no portion of inheritance in our father's house. If our father were to die today, there'd be nothing left for us because it's all been transferred over to Jacob, his wealth, or at least the majority of it. So in a sense, they're really just saying out loud in the form of a question that there's nothing left for us here. Go on to say, are we not counted of him as strangers? Which basically means that they've been purchased by Jacob and belong to Jacob now, which means they're not considered their fathers anymore. They're considered, in a sense, an alien to their father because they belong to Jacob. They belong to someone else. For he hath sold us and hath quite devoured also our money. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. So they're basically agreeing with Jacob. They're saying, there's nothing left for us here. We belong to you anyway. We're a family now. We are a part of your family now. And wealth is with you. We are with you. And you want to be saying, if God's told you to leave, let's do it. And they're even saying more than that. They're saying whatever God has said, let's be faithful. Let's do what our God has said. That's what they say. Verse 17, then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives on camels, carried away all his cattle and all his goods, which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Paddan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. Okay, so in verse 19 it says, and Laban went to shear his sheep. So Laban, to shear the sheep would have meant, a several days trip to go out into all the pastures. um, with other workers. It's sheep shearing time. It's sheep shearing season. So Laban leaves, and it says he went to shear the sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. Now, we don't really get any more details on this one little line here, other than she stole his. It says the images. These would have been idols, which indicates to us that Laban was worshiping other gods. He wasn't devoted to the one God. He had idols, so he was worshiping other gods. Now, it doesn't say why Rachel stole these. We don't know if she was worshiping other idols too. We don't know if she was trying to get revenge on her father because of all the suffering he had caused her. Um, Maybe she loved her father and she didn't like, maybe it bothered her that he worshipped idols. So they're getting ready to leave and she steals these idols, but it doesn't say why. So we can only speculate, at least at this point, as to why she stole the idols. Verse 20. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. Okay? Jacob wraps up his family and they leave, unaware to Laban. So he fled with all that he had, and he rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward Mount Gilead. Was fled, and he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. So Laban hears that Jacob has taken the entire family, all of the livestock, every of this wealth that he had amassed during those final 6 years that he was living there. He took everything and left secretly, and they pursue, which is really a picture of going after Jacob for not not for pleasantries, not because, he misses Jacob or he misses his daughters or they forgot something or he didn't say goodbye and he's sad about it. He's pursuing Jacob. He's mad. And it says that they overtook him in Mount Gilead, which basically means he catches up with them there. Verse 24, and God to Laban by night and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. They're camping there, Jacob there and his crew, or Laban and his whole crew of brethren, whatever, they're camping there, and he knows that Jacob, he can see his camp off in the distance. They're camping for the night so they can rest before they catch up with Jacob and do whatever that they want to do, confront him or whatever, harm him maybe, we don't know, it doesn't say. But there in the night, he gets a visit from God, and God tells him, basically, leave him alone. He says, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And if you're telling someone to speak not to someone good or bad, that's basically, you're telling them to leave it, let it go. Leave him be, because you're not supposed to speak anything good or anything bad. So what does Laban do? Verse 25. Then Laban overtook Jacob. He catches up with him. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword? He's basically accusing Jacob of kidnapping his family, because he says, you've taken them captive with the sword. And you left, unaware, which means you left without telling me. You snuck off, which he did. That's what he did. And I think that Jacob he snuck off because he was afraid of Laban. I mean, there were certain customs and, rituals and just expectations of the way you lived your life. And decided that Jacob hadn't earned these wives or worked hard enough for these wives, or if he had decided, to go back on his deal and wanted to overturn everything that he said and say, you can go, but you're leaving everything behind. He could have done that. It wouldn't have been fair or right, but he could have done it, and Jacob knew it. And so instead of acting in faith, God said, I want you to go and I'm going to be with you. He should have been like, okay, hey, Laban, we're out of here. That's what he should have done. But he didn't. He acted out of fear, and they did. They snuck off. Okay, so verse 27. This is still Laban speaking. Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly? So why did you sneak off? and steal away from me, and didst not tell me that I might have sent thee away with mirth and with tabret and with harp. So this word mirth just basically means it's like a religious celebration or exceeding joy. So he's saying, if you would have told me, I would have thrown you a big going away party. We would have celebrated and we could have sent you off properly and I could have said goodbye to my family. And, why did you sneak off? So, God told him not to say anything to Jacob. And instead, he's playing this contemptuous blame game, like making it seem like Jacob's the bad guy because, he's transferring any guilt that he has for, tricking Jacob, making him work all those years, changing his wages, all of the bad stuff he did, he doesn't want to take any responsibility for. He wants to shine a light on the fact that Jacob snuck out in the night, and stole away his chance to say goodbye to his family. So God told him not to say all that. He says it anyway. He says, and he says, verse 28, and hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast now done foolishly in doing so. So yeah, he's really giving Jacob a hard time for sneaking off. He's making it seem like he's the victim, like Laban's the victim in all of this. He's the good guy. Verse 29, he says, it is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But, he says, the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Which is exactly what we saw there. That's what God said. He says, and now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because you sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? So he's basically saying, I get it. You feel the desire to leave, to go, to start your own household, to not work for me anymore, to work for yourself. I get it. He said, I get it. You miss your father. You miss your homeland. But he says, where are my stolen gods? So again, he's trying to really transfer and make Jacob look like the bad guy. You snuck away. You took away my ability to say goodbye. And you've stolen my idols. So he's noticed that these idols that Rachel took are missing. And so he's saying, that's why I've come after you, is to retrieve my idols. Verse 31, and Jacob answered and said unto Laban, because I was afraid. He's answering, Jacob's asking him, why'd you leave in the night? And he said, I was afraid. I was afraid, this is my family. This is wealth that I have amassed fairly. And I was afraid that you might not see it that way. So he says, because I was afraid, he says, for I said, peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. He was afraid that, Laban would insist and take the daughters from him. Verse 32. With whomsoever, so this is Laban speaking, with whomsoever thou findest thy gods, or no, this is Jacob speaking. He says, let him not live. In other words, you can search my things, and whoever stole those gods, you can kill him. It says, and and let them not live. Before our brethren discern thou, before our brethren, he's saying you can search my things, but it's going to be before witnesses. There's going to be no more trickery here. Before the brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee, for Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. He didn't know that Rachel is the guilty party here. She's the one that stole her father's idols. He doesn't know that. She didn't tell anyone, or at least she didn't tell him. And he's basically telling Laban, search our belongings, and whoever's tent or satchel or pocket you find what you're looking for, anything that belongs to you, you can kill him. And I don't think Jacob was thinking that it might have been Rachel or it might have been one of his sons. I think he probably thought Laban was lying and he was calling his bluff. Maybe. But he certainly didn't think that it could have been Rachel. So verse 33, and Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the two maidservants' tent, but he found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the images, but put them in the camel's furniture, which I looked that up. It would have been the camel's saddle. So whatever these idols were, these images that Laban was worshiping, could have been a little statue, I don't know. Could have been a rock. I mean, I don't know what it was, but She had them and she put them in her camel saddle, and she sat upon them. So she's sitting up on this camel when her dad comes out of the tent. It says, and Laban searched all the tent but found them not. And she said to her father, up from the camel, she says to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. So she's using her period as an excuse to not get down off the camel so that they can search the camel. Says, and he searched but found not the images, and Jacob was wroth, which means, he was mad, he was grieving, he was hurt, he felt betrayed once again by Laban, because they've been accused of stealing these images. They've looked everywhere, they're not there. So he called Laban's bluff, and he probably thinks he's lying about the whole thing. He says, and Jacob was wroth, and he says, and chode with Laban, which is to argue or debate. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? What have I done to you, Laban? I have worked my tail off for you. You have deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. I amassed great wealth for you. And yeah, I took it away, but you were the one that agreed to that deal. It was fair and square. He says, what have I done that thou so hotly pursued after me? Verse 37, whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found of all my household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us. So that he just gets done searching all of his stuff, and he's like, show me what you found. Set it out here. Let everybody see what it is that we've taken. He goes on, he says, this 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, which is to say they were in my care and they didn't miscarry. They've been healthy. Oops. I just scrolled down by accident. They have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. So in other words, if they lost an animal because a lion or whatever devoured it, he says, it says, I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. So he's talking about the livestock that he protected as a shepherd. If it was killed, he said, I bear the loss of it. It was my responsibility. He says, thus I was in the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Shepherding was considered one of the hardest jobs. It was considered a dirty job, a laborious job. And he's kind of just, reaffirming, the drought by day, the frost by night, no sleep, exhaustion. This is the life that I've lived as I've worked for you. He says, thus, again, he says, I have been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters and 6 years for thy cattle. He's basically saying, I worked. I bought your daughters. I bought your cattle. I worked for those things within the context of deals that you and I struck together. Deals that you agreed to. He says, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Verse 42, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me. So in other words, unless God, if it had not been for God being with me, he said, surely thou had sent me away now empty. He's giving God the credit here that all of the blessing, all of the, all of these years that he's worked for Laban, if it had not been for God, then all this prosperity that Laban experienced wouldn't even have happened, and he would have sent him packing a long time ago. He's basically pointing out the only reason you've kept me around is because I've been of value to you, and the only reason I've been of value to you, he's saying, it's not because of me, it's because of God. So he's giving God credit here. He says, God hath seen my affliction. Surely you would have sent me away now empty. And that's true. He would have sent him away with what he showed up with. That's how it worked. God hath seen my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked thee yesternight. He's saying, that vision you had from God last night? That's because God has seen all that you've done to me. He's seen your deceit. He's seen your betrayal. He's seen your craftiness. He's seen it all, and that's why you got that visit last night from God saying to leave Jacob alone. Verse 43, and Laban answered and said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children, he's talking about the children of Jacob, these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, and unto their children which they have borne? He's basically saying he's not letting up here. He's letting Jacob know that all of this is mine. It's not yours. It's mine. But he says, how can I even provide for any of them? You've taken away all of my wealth. He says, of what can I do this day unto these my daughters and unto their children which they have borne? Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. So I don't know if Jacob or if Laban is really coming to his senses here and he realizes Jacob wins, God wins. There's nothing here for me to do other than to concede. Or if he's in the back of his mind, maybe he's just buying himself time so he can come up with another plan. I'm not really sure, it doesn't say. So, but he says, now therefore come, let us make a covenant. Verse 45. So Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar, and Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones. So this is how they would have had a ceremony to mark this covenant. They're building a pillar. They're stacking up these rocks. And it would have been a way, I mean, remember the times were very different. So when people were walking by and they would see a stack of rocks like that, they would probably ask, oh, hey, do you know what the significance is of that stack of rocks or that pillar or whatever? And if someone lived there in the area, they'd be like, oh yeah, that was the day that was the day that the Syrian Laban, reconciled with his son-in-law Jacob, and they struck a covenant and a peace agreement. That's what that's about. And nobody would have messed with these piles of rocks. They were considered important. They're meaningful, right? So here they're building this pile of rocks. And it says, and Laban called it Jagarsa Hadutha. Jagarsa Hadutha. That's my best. Laban called it Jagarsa Hadutha, but Jacob called it Galid. Remember, all names had meaning, so there would have been meaning. People would have walked by that temple. They're like, oh, yeah, that's Galid. That's the day the Syrian Laban reconciled with the son-in-law Jacob, and they struck a peace agreement. That would have been the meaning of this Galid. And when we look it up, both of these names have meaning. Trying to remember. Galid means, let's just look it up really quick. Verse 47. Scroll. Galid means a heap of testimony, and that word testimony is otherwise known as a covenant or an agreement. So it's a heap of testimony, which is basically what these pillars meant. They were a heap of testimony. That Jagar Sahud Hadutha, its meaning is a word derived from an unused root. To gather. It also says heap of the testimony. So anyway, let's get back. Scroll. Verse 47. So, but Jacob called it Galid, and Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and this day. Therefore was the name of it called Galid, and Mizpah, or Galid and Mizpah, for he said, the Lord, I got out of my dictionary. I forget what Mizpah means, but basically this heap it was known as Galid and Mizpah. He says, this is Laban talking, for the Lord which watch between me and thee when we are absent from one another. So in Laban's perspective, this altar that they built, its meaning is basically that God is watching over even though we're apart. I think that Laban is really trying to grab a little bit of God's goodness and put it on himself and saying, God's going to watch over you as we're apart, and he's going to watch over me too, and your family. Verse 50. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. This is like the father son in law talk. Basically, if you hurt my daughters, if you marry other women, you and I are going to have a talk. He says, no man is with us. In other words, it's not going to be your household, your military and my military. It's going to be a conversation between you and me. Says only God will witness what occurs in that conversation. He's threatening Jacob, in other words, to take care of my daughters, or you're going to answer to me and me alone. 51. And Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap. Did I already read that part? Well, he says it again, I guess. Behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. In other words, you can come home to visit, but it's not for harm. I can come to your land, but it's not to harm you. They're striking a peace agreement. Verse 53. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, this is still Laban speaking, the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judged betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. So Laban is basically calling upon, he's identifying exactly who this God is that they're talking about. Because remember, in his estimation, there are a bunch of gods. And yeah, the God of Abraham is one of them. It was perfectly normal to most people of the day that there's all these different gods present, and there's so many more gods that we could make up for different reasons. Limitless gods. And the God of Abraham is one of those gods. Here he's acknowledging the God of Abraham by saying exactly who that God is that they're talking about. It's the God of Abraham. Remember, Abraham was Jacob's grandfather. Nahor, Abraham's brother, was Laban's grandfather. These people would have understood the family ancestry, the stories that get passed down. Laban knows who Jacob's God is. He knows that it was the God of their grandfather Abraham, his grandfather Abraham, and of his grandfather Nahor. They were brothers. Remember, Abraham and Nahor and Haran, they were three brothers, the sons of Terah. Haran, he had the son Lot, which, remember, Abraham considered like a son. And then Nahor had a bunch of sons, and one of them was, I can't remember, the father of this Laban and Rebekah, which makes, remember, Laban and Jacob cousins. So he's swearing by that God, the God of Abraham, of Nahor, of Isaac, and he's saying, let that God judge between us. And let Jacob swear by the fear of his father Isaac, which is an interesting thing for Laban to say. Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount. So they killed an animal and they burned it on this fire. They offered sacrifice upon the mount and called his brethren to eat bread. And they did eat bread and tarried all night in the mount, which means they stayed together there all night. And early in the morning, Laban rose up and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. And Laban it. 55 verses. That's a long chapter. So that's chapter 31. As we continue in the story of Jacob, next week we'll continue in the story of Jacob. He's going to reunite with his brother. Remember Esau, the one that he stole the birthright and the blessing from when he was out hunting? So he's going to reconcile with his brother. That was the whole reason he even left, because his mom, Rebecca, was like, if you stay, I don't know if you'll live. Your brother is steaming hot mad. So they sent him off to give Esau time to cool down. And he was gone for 20 years. And we don't ever see that, Isaac and Rebecca came to visit. We don't know if Jacob even, for all he knows, his parents could be dead. Probably not. I mean, they could get word. They could send message. They had messengers. if his dad had died, he probably would have gotten word. So he's going home. He misses his father. He probably misses his mother. He's going. Learn more about that next week. Until then, God bless you guys. I continue to thank God for you, that you're here joining me each week. Praying God strengthen you, God protect you from evil for all people. So until we meet again, thank you so much for watching, and God bless.